Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. On Friday, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against Trump's tariffs by a margin of 6-3. Their decision said that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, also known as IEEPA, which Trump had used to invoke these tariffs, does not authorize the president to impose sweeping tariffs. Joining us to discuss is Monica Gorman. She's a managing director at Crowell Global Advisors and a former White House official who has deep experience in policymaking and international trade. Monica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I mentioned in my intro, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 against Trump's ability to invoke IEEPA when it comes to sweeping tariffs. What does this mean?
So first of all, this is a landmark decision. The decision is decisive. It is a 6-3 majority. You see three of the more conservative justices also joining the three more liberal justices. So the Supreme Court is speaking in a decisive fashion. And it really is a landmark ruling on the separation of powers. So the court is clear that tariffs are a tax and the power to tax lies with Congress. And so for that reason alone, this is a historic decision.
And I believe this decision does agree with two lower court decisions. Does that do anything to create legal precedent here, or can we infer about what it could mean for future presidents going forward?
Well, it's interesting in that this is a fairly narrow decision. It says that IEEPA does not allow the power to impose unlimited tariffs. But it doesn't say anything about the other statutes, many of which explicitly empower the president to impose tariffs. So with respect to IEEPA, it certainly sets a limit to executive authority. But beyond that, it doesn't tell us a whole lot. It doesn't even tell us anything on refunds. That is going back to the Court of International Trade to sort out over the next several months.
I was going to ask you about refunds, and perhaps we'll get there, but I want to get first to President Trump's reaction. After this Supreme Court decision, Trump had a press conference in which he said, quote, "In full force and effect, today I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged." Monica, were you surprised to hear this statement from the president? And then my follow-up to that is, how much power does he have to enforce this 10% global tariff?
So I was not surprised. The administration has been clear all along that they have a plan B. It also seems clear that the president's advisors knew that this was a potential outcome. And so everyone expected, I think, that they had been working on other potential options. And Section 122 is a clear statute. It does give the president power to impose tariffs up to 15% almost immediately. It is time limited, though, by 150 days. And so that gets us to roughly July. And at that point, if the tariffs are to be extended, it requires an act of Congress. So that's the difference here. IEEPA was interpreted by the president to be unlimited tariff authority. Section 122 is a clear tariff statute that he can use, but it is time bound and it is also limited in terms of the amounts that he can impose.
So he announced the 10% tariffs today, February 20th. So that means, is this a global 10%, by the way? All countries will pay 10%?
So we're still waiting for the executive order, and would direct everybody to that announcement when it comes out. That will ensure that we are clear on all of the details. But it does appear, based on his press conference, that yes, this would apply to all countries. But let's see what the executive order says to be sure.
What's been interesting is the market reaction. All the major indices rose immediately following the Supreme Court announcement. And yet we have the press conference with the president announcing a 10% tariff. What's your sense of businesses' reaction to the president's reaction?
I don't think the markets were particularly surprised. Looking at how oral argument went with the Supreme Court, the skepticism of a number of justices, this was not an unexpected ruling. Those of us who are steeped in trade could have debated the finer points of what the court might have done, but at the end of the day, looking at the oral argument, This is not unexpected. It's also not unexpected that the president was ready to go with Section 122. That is a very natural alternative that he could draw upon. And the president is on the record for decades of being very pro-tariff, seeing tariffs as an important tool. So again, it's not at all a surprise that he is going to continue to utilize every tool at his disposal to maintain a high tariff environment. And that is what businesses should expect going forward.
Now, in this court's 6-3 decision, we saw Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett voting alongside the liberal justices, along with Chief Justice John Roberts. President Trump has said he's, quote, ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what is right for our country, end quote. He had more to say, but I'm curious specifically about that comment about what is right for the country. You had said that the administration clearly had a backup plan, clearly feels strongly about instituting tariffs. Are tariffs the right thing for the American economy right now, in your view?
Well, the president is clearly frustrated and disappointed, and that came through clearly in his press conference. And he clearly believes that tariffs are the right tool. What the Supreme Court shows today, though, is that there are many different points of view, not only in whether tariffs are the right tool, but how they should be done. And that really, I think, when you look at the 6-3 majority, there were a number of concurring opinions, and how the different justices got to that majority does differ. And it represents the different perspectives that we are seeing here. That is a healthy debate to have, and I'm sure that is going to continue to play out, both in the statutes that the president does draw upon for his alternatives, and then also what Congress does. And we saw Mike Johnson on talking about what Congress may do with this. That actually is a great place for this to happen. Congress has the power to tax. Tariffs are a tool. If this debate does go to Congress, it's going to be very interesting. That would be a very healthy place to have this debate.
Now, earlier in this conversation, you mentioned refunds, and we do, of course, have a story on Forbes.com. Breaking this down a little bit, one of my colleagues spoke to trade experts who told Forbes that electronics companies and companies making retail and consumer products could see the biggest benefits from these tariffs being struck down. What does that then mean, both for prices going forward, but also looking at the last 12 to 18 months? Could we see refunds?
So the refund question, again, the majority was silent on this. So this note goes back to the Court of International Trade. So I think we can anticipate a messy several months, if not longer, to figure out what the refund process is. That is going to be a challenge that creates ongoing uncertainty. I would be surprised if we see an immediate impact to prices because of that. Businesses are going to be waiting to see what happens. Are they getting refunds? If so, when? If so, at what level? A lot of questions still remaining. Similarly, the president's already announced new tariffs. So going forward, we're absolutely going to be in a high tariff environment. So again, what does that mean for prices? I would be surprised if you saw any immediate changes.
And over the last 14 months or so, we have seen the president and his administration create trade deals across the globe, as several countries move very quickly to try to avoid a 20, 30, 40% tariff. What happens to those deals? Do we know? Does this ruling say anything about those deals?
So the ruling, of course, is silent on the deals. That was not part of what the court was considering. And that is one of the big questions coming out of today. I would anticipate of the framework deals that have been struck, the countries with whom they've been struck are likely to live up to those deals. However, a number of those deals are still very much at a high level framework agreement level. They don't go into the detail that typical free trade agreements would go into. A lot of those details are still being negotiated. And what this ruling may do is embolden some of the foreign partners to push back on some of the US demands, recognizing that the president does not have unlimited tariff authority. The president's ability to threaten tariffs now, which he's been using IEEPA to do that, that is somewhat circumscribed by this ruling. So it's going to be interesting to see. I would expect in broad terms the frameworks will stick, but the devil could be in the details, and those details now are up for negotiation.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that some nations could push back. It's hard to generalize across the entire globe, but what do you expect to see in the reactions from our trade partners, from the rest of the world in response to the Supreme Court's ruling today?
I would not anticipate immediate reaction. This is very much a sort of US domestic constitutional question that the Supreme Court just decided. I would imagine foreign partners will be watching to see how this plays out. Um, Immediate reactions would seem unlikely.
Immediate reactions would seem unlikely. It feels like there's a lot of wait and see. It's a landmark decision, as you said, but there's a lot that remains unknown. What are your biggest questions going forward? What will you be watching for?
It will be interesting to see what role Congress plays. Again, we have Section 122 that gets us through to roughly July. In terms of the immediate tariffs, President is likely to initiate other investigations under Section 301, for example, which would allow additional potential tariffs to be imposed. So again, I anticipate that high tariff environment. There's a big question here, though. The president has talked about tariffs as uh, the way to bring back US manufacturing, to reinvigorate our industrial base and make America great again. And that still remains an open question. How do we create an environment where US manufacturing is robust? That requires certainty. One could argue that IEEPA tariffs didn't create certainty because they were done with executive authority. That's now been struck down. What I'm waiting to see is, does Congress take this up? It won't be quick. Congress is unlikely to act swiftly, but a silver lining in all of this would be if Congress would actually take it up and discuss what is the best way to really strengthen our supply chains, reinvigorate our industrial base. How do we do that? Are tariffs a tool? If we could have that debate, then that would be a really fantastic outcome.
We've covered a lot of ground, Monica, but is there anything else the Forbes audience should know or anything else consumers should know as they hear this news and perhaps hope that we get an answer, at least on the refund part of this equation?
It's big news, but I wouldn't expect immediate changes. Again, big constitutional question. Plan B was ready to go. So I wouldn't expect big changes up or down in terms of prices. Probably more of the same for the immediate term for consumers. But again, let's see where this goes as we get into the months, as we see what Congress does, we see what investigations come out. It's certainly going to be an interesting next several months.
Monica Gorman, Managing Director at Crowell Global Advisors. Thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your insight here.
Thanks for having me.